So, without further ado, I'd like to welcome to the stage Dr. Louis Peachey to address everyone regarding the 50th anniversary since the Australian referendum. Dr. Louis Peachey is a Gidjamay man from the Jidabalagan language group of North Queensland. He's a senior medical officer at the Atherton District Hospital, where he works as a rural generalist anaesthetist and runs a regular clinic at Lotus Glen Correctional Centre. And I'll invite Louis to continue. Thank you.
All right, okay, that's loaded up and ready to go by the looks. Thanks everybody for coming. It's lovely to be back with family again. I'd like to thank our traditional owners for a welcome, and I'd like to acknowledge elders and ancestors. I don't have much of a personal connection to here in Victoria, being a North Queensland rainforest Aborigine, but the one connection, which is a little bit vague, to the local Kulin Nation. You had a domestic terrorist down here some number of years ago. I think his name was Edward Kelly, and he murdered a few people. Apparently he murdered 2 Irish Catholic police officers along with a Protestant, and then had a whinge later about the persecution of Catholics, which I find a little astonishing. But anyway, that stuff happens. My great-grandfather, Noble Rand, was one of the trackers who tracked him down, and a very significant leader in these parts, William Baruch, was also one of the trackers, and he was a substantive leader at a community of Corundurk, which is around about where the Healesville Sanctuary is these days. Victoria has also been a pretty important place for Aboriginal advancement. William Cooper, a man who grew up on Cumragunja, he came down to here, and it was here in Melbourne that he led a march in protest of Kristallnacht, and it was the only private protest of what happened to Jewish people just prior to the outbreak of World War II. So an Aboriginal man, hearing the story of what was happening to Jewry, was overcome with compassion and led a group of Aboriginal people to the German consulate. Needless to say, being that they were black, the German consulate wouldn't accept their letter, but nevertheless it was a very important protest, and I understand that in the Holocaust Museum there's a plaque paying homage to that. Of course, one of his nephews was Doug Nicholls. So Douglas Nicholls, Knight Commander of the Victorian Order, an extraordinary man, a man who had a AFL career down here. I understand he tried to play for Carlton, but the boys didn't want to share a dressing room, and so he played for Northcote, and I understand he had a premiership or 2 under his belt as well. Terrible shame about Carlton. Sorry for any supporters in the room, it's just what it is. So this is Sir Douglas Nicholls was a man who was absolutely pivotal in the early movement of the advancement of Aboriginal people. William Cooper never lived to see the results of his hard work, but it's one of those things, as I'm getting older, and having been at the AIDA 20th just a month ago with Lucy, the one thing that I understand now as I get to be an older man is it doesn't matter if I see the promised land. Sorry. Because I know my children will. And we'll get there. And there's this incredible group of young people coming through the Australian Indigenous Doctors Association, just truly, truly extraordinary. Back in my day, I tell the story that, we're like the speed skater, blackfellas in my day. If we were left standing then at the end of the race, then we got ourselves a medal. But these new people who are coming through are just truly extraordinary, and they are doing us proud within the profession. And I'll come back to that a little later. Look, in this, one of the important things you'll notice that I'm using a number of quotes, and the reason I'm using a number of quotes is for a very simple reason, that I have nothing to say to you today which is new. Everything that I have to say has already been said, and it's actually being said by better and wiser people than I'll ever care to be. In Ecclesiastes 1:9, we're told, "What has been will be again, what has been done will be done again. There is nothing new under the sun." Now look, I also know people are going to get a little bit frightened because I'm straying into politics. And I can hear it in the crowd. "Oh, Louis, we're an academic college. We're here to do academics. We're not here to do politics," which is sweet. And of course, as we remember, Rudolf Virchow told us that medicine is a social science and politics is nothing else but medicine on a large scale. So what is it that happened in the 67 referendum? There are two parts of the Constitution which need a little bit of fixing up. So 51(26), of course. The Parliament shall, subject to this Constitution, have the power to make laws for peace, order, good government and commonwealth with respect to, and a whole bunch of subsections talk about, fishing and marriage and a whole bunch of other things. And when we got down to 26, for people of any race other than the Aboriginal race in any state, for whom it is deemed necessary to make special laws. And so the highlighted bit is what we managed to remove in the 67 referendum, and we'll come back to some of that in a bit. The other part was Section 127, and Section 127 is like the 13th floor in the hotel now. When you read through the Constitution, it's, 126, 128, ooh, okay. And so this is in the reckoning of the numbers of people of the Commonwealth or of a state or other part of the Commonwealth, Aboriginal natives shall not be counted. So when we were excluded from the life of Australia, you can see that those great men, Henry Barks, William Barton, Edmund Barton, and Mr. Deakin, they didn't just sort of accident. It wasn't that they used the Microsoft Constitution Maker and that sort of accident. When you use the Constitution Wizard in Microsoft, you'll get a couple of clauses that you didn't intend. These guys were all lawyers. They understood that you earn a buck in the British system by the more words you write in a contract. They were literally paid by the word, and so those words were put in there very purposefully. Now, there were a lot of rights that had already been present to numbers of Aboriginal people in the country prior to the 67 referendum. New South Wales on the far left there, in many ways, and Queensland on the far right. Coincidentally. So you can see that in New South Wales, Aboriginal people as at 1963 had the right to vote. They had the right to marry freely, to control their own children, to move freely. Just move freely, so in the good old days, if I wanted to take a trip from home down to Cairns, an hour and a half, I'd have to go to the local protector's office, beg at the door for permission to travel, please and boss. And if I was a good blackfella, then he'd give me a little certificate. And when I got to the other end, I wanted to come back home. I had to go to the protector down there, or please and boss, may I be going back home? And then he'd be very, very gracious and give me another certificate to go back home. Good old days. Well, we didn't have mobile phones and GPS trackers back then, so I suppose there was some, functionality in it. We didn't, in New South Wales, they had the right to own property. In New South Wales, at that stage, they had the right to receive their own award wages. So in Queensland, because we're a bit uneducated, on our behalf, the government collect our wages, which was very, very kind of them. Unfortunately, they lost some of the bookwork and accounting a little bit later on, entirely accidentally. And so there's been a bit of a dispute about that. Now, admittedly, Aboriginal people in New South Wales weren't allowed alcohol. People who know me know I'm a teetotaler, and I know I should be outraged by that. I just can't bring myself to it. In Queensland, you'll note that we had no voting rights. And interesting with this second line, the shadows of the past that wash over us, isn't it? So I, as a middle-aged Aboriginal heterosexual man, have just been asked to take part in a survey asking whether or not two lovely young men, Tom and Harry, are allowed to get married. I don't know how it impacts on me. I've never met these lovely young men. I'm sure they care about each other as much as I care about my wife and stuff. But apparently my opinion as to whether or not they should be allowed to get married is something that really matters. And look, as somebody who comes from a people who had to ask permission for pretty much everything, almost passing wind, I can't just help but feel it's a little bit insulting that a bunch of people who aren't affected at all by a decision should somehow be involved in in asserting whether or not it's okay. Now, I know people have their own opinions, and that's okay. I just don't comprehend it. So the Electoral Act, so there was an Enfranchisement Act which was in 1902. So in 1901, at the time of Federation, the rules to vote, if you had voting rights in your state, you had voting rights in the Commonwealth. And so there were a number of Aboriginal people and other darkies, South Sea Islanders and Torres Strait Islanders, and some various brown people with Middle Eastern names who appeared on the electoral rolls. And it was in 1902 with the Franchise Act, which later became the Electoral Act, which just clarified that when we meant all people, we meant all white people. And so there was a few changes that happened there. In 1962 was Bob Menzies who altered that act and actually extended voting rights to Aboriginal people. In Queensland, of course, I know this comes as an enormous surprise in my home state. It took a little bit longer for the authorities up there to accept it, but finally about 1965 the National Country Party just stepped aside and got out of the way and allowed Aborigines the possibility that they might vote, which is incredibly gracious of them, I thought. Of course, being as we still didn't count on the census, if there's a whole bunch of Aborigines in a town, then there was no redistribution to make sure that they were properly represented in Parliament, because in the reckoning of numbers, we were still absent. The referendum, however, was an overwhelming endorsement by the Australian people that Aboriginal people, or Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, should be fully included in the life of the Commonwealth. And it was an overwhelming vote. It was well in the 90s, pretty much across the board. And so in 1967, we earned the right to be counted. And as you're probably aware from the Uluru Statement, in 2017, we're asking for the right to be heard. An interesting thing with the Uluru Statement, so it came out under the auspices of the Referendum Council. So there's some pretty important people there, 14 folks from various different walks of life who are on the Referendum Council. You'll remember that about the day after it was published, our Deputy Prime Minister came out and started giving some advice, about how difficult it would be constitutionally to enact anything that was in the Uluru Statement. And look, I know that white people do these things, and I know that you've got a different way, and I don't always understand it. From my point of view, a thing that confused me a little is a gentleman who's a certified practicing accountant was apparently giving unsolicited constitutional advice to this group of 14 people, which, in and of itself may not be necessarily bad, but the problem is 7 of the 14 people are lawyers. One Aboriginal lady there, a professor, she's actually a professor of constitutional law. There's another name, there's some grey heads in the room, we might remember a gentleman by the name of Murray Gleeson, I know that. Former Chief Justice of the High Court. I found it really fascinating that in none of those engagements with the journalists, there wasn't a single journalist and said, Deputy Prime Minister, are you genuinely comfortable with giving unsolicited constitutional advice to a professor of law and a former Chief Justice of the High Court? It's possible they may have read that once or twice. I'm just saying, So we've got some barriers to overcome in this country, and racism is one. Now, I was telling my daughters sort of what the content of my speech was going to be, and I said, oh yes, well, Bubby, I'll have to explain, because the question that's always asked, oh, Lewis, do you think Australia's a racist country? And my baby was incredulous. Sorry, what is the question? What they don't know? No, Bubby, people really want, no, surely not. That's not been answered? No, we still got to explain it. Oh. Anyway, so example number 1 of how much of a racist country we are. Our constitution, all citizens in this audience remember this document, which is our foundation document of our federation, which represents our citizenry. We maintain that the Parliament, blah, 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 can make laws for people of any race for whom it is deemed necessary to make special laws. Now, I understand why we as a people might want to make laws against people who, I don't know, beat up their spouses, mistreat their children, steal, drive too fast in a car, do bad things to other people. if anybody in this room is able to give me an understanding as to why it is necessary in this day and age to make any law under any circumstance regarding a race of people, I'd be very, very glad to hear it. If we retain the right to make laws about races, then that makes us, what's that term? Racist. You know. AFL legend Adam Goodes. This is an extraordinary man. Now, I'm not a football fan. I think I'm sort of here as contrast to the sporting people coming behind me, because obviously I'm not. As an Aboriginal child in my predominantly white school, I wasn't allowed to hold a football. I wasn't allowed to hold a cricket bat. I wasn't allowed to hold a cricket ball unless I happened to be standing its way far out in the field, in which case I was meant to throw it back at the lovely white kids. So apart from that, I was excluded from sport. That's not the only reason I'm fat, I'm sure, but you know, I don't think it was a good start to life, to be honest. This man, legend, Brownlow. So the pinnacle achievement or the pinnacle award in this particular profession is the Brownlow Medal, which he won twice. He was on the AFL All-Australian team, 2003, 2006, 2009, 2011. International Rules Series 2001, 2010 as a captain. He's in a premiership side 2005, 2012, and Australian of the Year 2014. I thought he'd earned his business. I thought he'd done what he needed to do. In 2014, because this blackfellow was named Australian of the Year, a lot of the good folk in the crowd started to get a bit pissed off about it. Yes, I know there's that little thing about, the 13-year-old child who called him an ape, she couldn't actually know what it meant. Well, first of all, if we listen to what he said, he was very compassionate towards it. But nevertheless, there was no need for it to be tolerated. And the fact that her parents didn't actually bother to teach the child that never came under scrutiny, except about how tough it was for the parents. Then later on, during the Indigenous round, he'd done a dance, which our good friend Andrew Bolt described this as a war dance, and Andrew was all sad on the radio because he'd upset these white people by throwing an imaginary spear at them, because I understand how frightening that can be. However, it was not a spear. How do you know that, I hear you ask? Because this dance was a dance taught to him by a group of young men, the youth arm of the Indigenous youth arm of the AFL, called the Flying Boomerangs. I know this will come as a surprise, but the implement that is thrown during the dance of the Flying Boomerangs, you're following me, aren't you? It's a boomerang. Number 2, boomerang is for hunting, not warfare. It was not a war dance. This man was celebrating what men have celebrated since the beginning of time, bringing home the bacon, bringing home the protein part of the diet. That's what he was celebrating. He was celebrating these wonderful young men who this is a man who was, entering his mid-adulthood, who'd never been taught an Aboriginal dance because of how much culture would rob from him as a child. These young men taught him a dance. He was so overwhelmed with love for these young men that on a national stage he wanted to pay homage to them. And this country had the audacity to turn this thing of love and beauty into an act of violence. Okay? Not long after that, Prince Harry came out, and when he went to New Zealand and did the haka over there, this country was, oh, that's so lovely. A man who did a war dance, okay, with a group of natives in another part of the Commonwealth, and we thought that was lovely. A man who didn't do a war dance, but did a dance of love and provision for the family, it was outrageous, and he scared the white folk. Waleed Ali, actually, he nailed it on I'm a nerd, I watch the ABC. So on the inside, on the outsiders, yeah, thank God for the ABC, and please, Pauline, keep your hands off it. Sorry, straying into politics, rude of Voice. So Waleed told us, I think it was the fact that this was some kind of cultural expression that some people found confronting, Ali said. There is no mystery about this at all. And it is not as simple as about being race. It's about something else. It's about the fact that Australia is a generally tolerant society until its minorities demonstrate that they don't know their place. And at that moment, the minute someone in a minority position acts as though they are not a mere supplicant, we lose our minds and we say, no, no, you've got to get back in the box here. The other issue that we face is Australians are a historical people. I know that's a terrible assertion to make, and there's a crowd of incredibly highly intelligent and accomplished individuals in the room, and so I'm just going to try and make a gentle illustration to you about whether or not you know your history. So this, of course, we'll recognise as our flag of federation, don't we? With the six-pronged star and how beautiful it is, and that little star is a star of federation that represented the 6 states of the country. And at Federation, this is that wonderful flag. Except, of course, this flag didn't happen until after Federation. This flag, of course, no doubt you'll now recognise, oh yes, of course, that's the Federation flag. Yeah, this is the Federation flag, formerly the ensign of New South Wales, but that's actually the Federation flag. This flag, of course, is the flag that as citizens back then, when it was approved, we would have flown, because this is actually the civilian flag. Because a blue flag, as no doubt you'll all know, was a government flag and only to be used for government purposes. And it was actually the red ensign that was the flag of the people. Of course, the substantive flag, which was a major flag, was, as we all recognise, to my Scottish friends, the Butcher's apron, to the rest of us with a great deal of love, the Union Jack. My dad got remarried about 10 years ago to a lovely lady who was Welsh, and she was worried whether or not Dad's 2 Aboriginal sons would accept her. And we were having a conversation, Mum, what's your concern? Oh, well, you know, I don't want you to think that I'm replacing your mother. I know that you're Aboriginal and I can't actually... I said, but Mum, you're Welsh, aren't you? Yeah. What's the representation of Wales in the Union Jack? So there's a cross of St George from the English, there's a cross of St Andrew from the Scots, there's the cross of St Patrick from the Irish. Which bit represents you? Oh, nothing. You know why, Mum? Because you're an invisible people too. You're not white. Anyway, so there's the Union Jack. And that was our flag. That was our official flag until, of course, 1953, albeit that legislation wasn't gazetted or didn't get royal assent until 1954. This flag was actually the flag, and it's the flag that our soldiers fought under. You know the argument, oh, we can't change the flag because our men served under this flag? No. The red ensign. Now, for the young people in the crowd who think I might be making shit up, and that's okay, if you do a Google Images search on Sydney Mail and War, so Sydney Mail was the weekend magazine of the Sydney Morning Herald back in the day, and you'll find a whole bunch of front page publications. The predominant flag that's shown there is the Union Jack. The second most commonly appearing flag on those covers will be the red ensign, and just very, very occasionally you may or not see a blue ensign, but it's not a substantive feature. Of course, the 7 prongs, now it's one of those things, when I was at school I was taught that the 7th prong was for the Northern Territory and then later the ACT, which is sort of true. Does anybody happen to know what territory that 7th prong represented? Okay. Yes, brother, absolutely. So in 1906, of course, New Guinea became a territory of the Commonwealth, and the 7th prong represented New Guinea. When Northern Territory was formed in 1911, and then later on we had the ACT, then they said, oh, it's all right, we've already got a prong for the territories. We'll roll them all in one. We don't need to worry about it. This actually became the official flag in 1953, a Royal Assent 1954. And ultimately, if you read what Bob Menzies said, red, of course, had become a bad colour. He was fighting commas and stuff, and so, no, I'm serious. And so he wanted to change it to a blue flag because, you know, it was more in keeping with the time, which is sweet. 1 year after the referendum, an extraordinary gentleman, W.E.H. Stanner, a man who had actually distinguished himself in service in the Second World War. He was the commanding officer of what was later to become North Force, you know, a pretty extraordinary sort of a gentleman. who'd been is an anthropologist up until his passing. He gave the Boyer Lectures in 1968 and he coined the phrase the Great Australian Silence. And he noted with his extensive work with people, particularly through the Northern Territory, that Aboriginal people remained absent from history and in fact from the conversation and life of the Commonwealth. And to be honest, it hasn't changed an awful lot. You know, I talked about shadows of the past before, and you know, George Santayana in his three-tome immortal classic, The Life of Reason, he is the one who actually told us that those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. And I think this really is a genuine warning for us that we need to learn about these things or we can never move on from it. Stan Grant recently, as you're probably aware, made a suggestion that it could be an explanatory plaque put at the bottom of the Captain Cook statue in Hyde Park. The Prime Minister, measured in his response, noted that, made a reference to Stan's comments. He was also talking about the Yarra Council and referred to him as Stalinist. Now, this was a lesson for me. Up until that point, I thought the sins of Joe Stalin included things like murdering 20 to 30 million of his own citizens, the creation of the Gulag system, pogroms against Russian Jewry, pogroms against Russian homosexuals. I thought that those were his sins. I hadn't realised, and the Prime Minister taught me this, thank you so much, Malcolm, that stuff is okay for a head of state to do, but putting an explanatory plaque at the bottom of a statue, my God, that's just too far. You know. And I note that nobody actually examined the Prime Minister about that. Nobody took him to task. Nobody actually said, Prime Minister, seriously, that's not a little outrageous, calling Stan Stalinist because he wanted an explanatory plaque? Oh, by the way, I know the statue was defaced later. And listen, I know people want to blame Stan for that. And if you blame Stan for the defacing of that statue, fine, I'm sure that you go to McDonald's and blame Ronald McDonald when you get a bad hamburger. Okay, it's about as sensible, and it's just a little ridiculous. The City of Yarra, I know this is going to be too small for most people to read, certainly my age. The City of Yarra voted to have a small culturally sensitive event, including a smoking ceremony and supporting the Change the Date campaign. The Prime Minister, outraged, and noted that, you know, using the day that should unite Australians to divide Australians. Now, the grandfather of Federation, I mentioned this gentleman before, Sir Henry Parkes, leading up to the centenary celebrations, he made a point when he was asked about, so there's this book that appears in the top right-hand corner. You can download it off the screen. Some people have tried to say, oh, Lewis, how could the Prime Minister know it was there? I'll explain that in a minute. Anyway, on page of that, the historian tells us there had been much debate in Sydney about what kind of celebrations should mark the centenary. Sir Henry Parkes, Premier of New South Wales, planned something for everyone, or almost everyone. When questioned what was being planned for the Aborigines, Parkes retorted, and remind them that we have robbed them? Okay, one, this man knew it wasn't a celebration for us. Two, he understood the theft, or the original sin of this country, which was theft of land. This is not new, this is old people. Cultural awareness. Now, there's a lot of people who like to have the little bit of a belief that, you know, as long as good intentions, then that's all that matters. But remember what Albert Camus said to us. The evil that in the world is almost always comes from ignorance. Good intentions may do as much harm as malice if they lack understanding. So it's not enough to just have good intention, you want to know something about it. Now, the problem is we always get asked to talk to you people about what it is that you don't understand about us. The erroneous premise of that thing is that we don't understand everything about you. But you know, we are eager to learn, and if any of you want to run the cultural awareness session for teaching blackfellas to understand you more, I know a couple of us will sign up. I'm pretty eager myself. But before you can teach us about this, you'll need to understand more about your own culture. It was Aidan Ridgway in an address to the UN, and these beautiful poetic words. Many Australians are keen to embrace the rhetoric of reconciliation so long as it doesn't require them to take effective action to share the country's abundant resources. Few are prepared to really look within themselves to challenge their beliefs and values for fear of what they might find or fear of what they might lose. And I think that that's the crippling part that we face in this situation. Next steps. The responsibility of intellectuals, as reminded by Noam Chomsky, international leading linguist and political dissident, and in his essay of that title back in 1967, which I know was homage to a previous writer, he summarises as to speak the truth and expose lies. When we hear our politicians talking shit, like that Stan is a Stalinist because he'd like an explanatory plaque put at the bottom of an old statue, then we as a people, we as professionals, we should be writing letters with our name and our title saying, Prime Minister, it's beneath your dignity to make those silly assertions. Please stop doing it. We don't need to berate him, we don't need to tell him he's a bad man, but we do need to remind him it's beneath his dignity as a man who holds high office. And we do have a responsibility, what was said before, but also General David Hurley. He's the guy who said the standard you walk past is the standard you accept. I know it's accredited to General Morrison. General Morrison is the person who's tried to tell everybody that no, I was just quoting David Hurley when he said that. But it's a really important, it's a thing, the standard you walk past is the standard that you accept. Currently in our college, I'm sorry, I'm about to run out of time, there are 6 Indigenous fellows at the moment. There are 5 Aboriginal men. There is 1 Aboriginal woman. I have no doubt that everybody knows her name, and I think it's not unreasonable that I expect everybody to know the name of Dr. Sarah McEwen, because let's face it, there's only one name you need to know. For those who may vaguely know that name, this young lady received the FACRRRM Registrar of the Year award at the Hobart annual doings in 2010. Now, one of the things that just astounds me, and by the way, there are no Torres Strait Islander fellows as yet, the Aboriginal women are educated at twice the rate of Aboriginal men. Why it is that we only have 1 Aboriginal woman with the fellowship while there's 5 Aboriginal men, I'm sorry, just truly astounds me. And I'm sure Lucy will attest with me, who was at the AIDA conference with me a month ago. There is no shortage of young women who are desperate to become part of this college. Now, the reason, I know for a fact that 4 of the 6 people who are fellows, one of them being me, the other 3 I know very well, they are fellows of this college because they were mentored. They were fellows of this college because this is the college who embraced them. In this room is a rank of people who have mentored me and protected me and looked after me along the way. Truly extraordinary people from things, I learned extraordinary things. One of the things that we did in the early days of AIDA, a simple rule is that is equanimity and be the last to leave the table. Whatever the negotiating table, be the last to leave. 2 principles taught to me, of course, by Cole Owen and Bruce Chater, as I watched these 2 men negotiate their way through pretty extraordinary politics of the time. And I would not be here if it wasn't for a truly generous act of a bunch of people who didn't know me from anything, but sought to try and give me a better opportunity, for which I'm grateful. So women in the audience particularly, men, it does apply to you too, but genuinely women in the audience. The catch cry of modern women trying to break the glass ceiling is, you can't be what you cannot see. If these young Aboriginal women are not seeing strong women role models in this college, who embrace them, who protect them, who nurture them, then we're not going to see those numbers increase. And we really do need to see those numbers increase. So, mentor your hearts out. Just as a final note, and I am trying to step away from the podium, no, there isn't any time to answer questions. Me and the ALS boys, we're playing here all week. We've got multiple gigs. If anybody does have any questions, please don't hesitate to come along and ask. Thank you.
Thank you, Louis. You've done it again. You have made me laugh when actually what I want to do is cry from the things that you're teaching me. Thank you.